I want full control over when the slides go. That's a Mac thing. You can't have full control. So I have to keep pace. I have to keep pace with the slides and let it determine. Hit spacebar? But how do I make it stop going by itself? Let's see. It looks to be that it's... Okay, hi. I'm Dmytri Kleiner, and this talk is called Mr. Peel Goes to Cyberspace, Resisting Digital Colonization. I really wish I was here yesterday to see the an architecture and the PC 2.0 talks, because I think there's a lot of commonalities in the kind of things we're talking about. Like lots of people, I was really excited in the 90s about the prospects of the internet and disintermediation, and the idea that these new forms of centralized would really change the world, not only from a communication and technology point of view, but also from a political and social point of view. That's having a network in which kind of peer-to-peer social relations were embedded in the architecture would allow us to kind of disintermediate governments and banks and institutions and all this kinds of stuff. And it was a really kind of exciting idea. As some of you may remember, it didn't really work out that way. And rather than building the most disintermediated system in history, the internet became the most mediated history, the most surveyed, the most controlled, the most measured. So rather than this kind of great free cyberspace that we were envisioning back then, we rather instead ended up with this kind of dystopian panopticon. And so the work of Telekommunism and the Counterantidisintermediation group that's based here in Berlin is to kind of think through and understand why that happened, how our disintermediation failed. Right. So one funny thing that I noticed is that if you look in chapter 33 of Marx's Capital, in the section about colonization, there's a lot of really interesting similarities between colonization and how the internet got centralized. So taking from E.J. Wakefield, which is a British political politician from the area of colonization. He's also mentioned by Henry George and others. So he was a significant theorist of colonization. He tells the story of Mr. Peel. Mr. Peel is a hopeful capitalist. He took 50,000 pounds with him to Swan River, Australia, along with 300 people of the working class, men, women, and children. So everything that one needs to be a successful capitalist in the new world. However, once he arrived at his destination, Mr. Peel was left without a servant to make his bed or fetch him water from the river. And the reason for that is there was tons of free land in Australia. There was no real English mode of production. So all the people that he brought just kind of fucked off and got their own land, and he really had no way to force them to work for him, to force them to sell their labor to him, so he could be a capitalist. So he was a failed capitalist, unhappy Mr. Peel. So he discovered that capital was not a thing. You can't just bring it in a bag to Australia, but it's the social relationships between people that's instrumentalized by things, that's established by the instrumentality of things, right? So unhappy Mr. Peel provided for everything except for the export of the English mode of production to Swan River. So the only way that capitalism can work is if along with the capital comes the mode of production that makes it work, right? Property and money, means of subsistence, machines, and other modes of production does not as yet make you a capitalist. Just having a bunch of stuff doesn't make you a capitalist, right? There has to be the other, the wage worker, the other man or woman that's compelled to sell their labor to you in order to make the capitalist relationship work, right? So the means of production and subsistence, while they remain the property of the immediate producer, are not capital as such, right? They only become capital under circumstances where they can compel labor and exploit and subject the laborer. Right, so the capitalists weren't too happy about this. They called this labor scarcity. It was also a problem in America with potential workers, fucking off on their own land and not being good wage workers for the capitalists. Right, so E.G. Wakefield came up with a plan. What if we seize all the land by decree and make it all owned by the government, and then only sell it for way more than it's actually worth to the people that want to use it, ensuring that only rich people can now have any access to the land. Sure. Is that good? Turn down the bass. We need more treble. More technical theater. Right. So all the land is sort of privatized by the government and then sold to rich people, and nobody else has any land, so everybody has to now work for the rich people. That's the Wakefield plan, and that's what kind of formed the. If you think about the internet in that same kind of way, if the means of communication are also in everybody's hands, then they're also not capital. In order to make capital of the means of communication, you have to become an intermediary. You can't. If everybody can communicate, if everybody has the tools of production, then those tools are not properly capital, right? In the same sense that they were in colonization, right? And so decentralized platforms replaced with centralized platforms, and we'll go into more on the mechanics of that. But it's not simply a question of building new decentralized platforms, because we already kind of had them. So we have to understand why we went from a decentralized internet to a centralized internet in the first place. And this is not just an engineering problem. As Lucy Parsons famously say, never be deceived that the rich will permit you to vote away their wealth. We also need to understand that the capitalists will not permit us to code away their wealth, right? That ours is a political challenge as well as a technical challenge. And so in order to understand the challenge, you have to understand its political and economic dimensions as well as the many technical questions that we have to solve. Right? So one place that we like to start is the idea of consent. Here's my enemy, Hal Varian, chief economist of Google. But in 2004, he made this statement, which I completely agree with, even though I don't really agree with his work in general. I do not in general want them to share this information with third parties. He's talking about platforms. He's saying the issue is not privacy per se, but rather trust. Consumers want to know how information is used. So he doesn't want third parties to share the information without their consent, right? But however, centralized platforms require control of user interaction and capture of user data to make profits. So the way that the internet digital colonization works is that capitalists control intermediary nodes, right? And because they control intermediary nodes, they can control the user interactions to charge subscription fees, or they can collect the data to make the audience themselves into a form of commodity they sell to advertisers, so-called audience commodity. Right? That's the business model. That's the business model of the colonized internet. In order to do that, a mandatory sacrifice of consent is required. You can't use those platforms unless you agree to let them share data about you to third parties as part of their terms of service, and you can't also use those networks if you don't agree to their terms, that to use your real name, to only post images they approve of, etc. So a mandatory sacrifice of consent is required. So it's unclear how Google's chief economist can imagine consent being engineered into this kind of network. And so we developed kind of this lexicon, and it's still kind of ongoing, and the way we kind of talk about the problems of decentralization, right? And in order to have consent, you need to have privacy. The network needs to provide certain guarantees of privacy in order for consent to be possible. So even if privacy is not per se the central focus, right, in order to make a network that ensures consent, it has to provide certain guarantees of privacy, right? And privacy requires what we call counter-anti-disintermediation, which I'll go over in the next couple of slides. And that itself requires what we call venture communism, because counter-anti-disintermediation will not be funded by capital, because capital depends on centralization, control of user data, control of user interaction. The kinds of systems that don't function in a way that delivers that must must not be funded by capitalism. So if venture capital won't fund it, we need to find other ways, other cooperative and social ways to fund it, right? And so venture capitalism requires what we call transvestment, which is the idea that we need to think about modes of production as happening at the same time and how we can transfer value from one mode to another mode. And this requires technological disobedience, that we can't simply use the equipment that's being provided by industry in the way and the terms that they want to use it. We need to use things differently, we need to use things longer, we need to use things in different ways, we need to use them in technologically disobedient way. In order to do that, we need to have counter politics, because our ability to do anything with technology or with networks depends on our ability to deal with our medical costs, to have housing, to have healthcare, to have childcare, to have all the kind of like social infrastructure that's required for us to build any kind of alternative at all, be it technological or social. So we'll go through those a little bit slower. There's on the terms: counter-anti-disintermediation, venture communism, consent-oriented networks, technological disobedience, and counter-politics. Right, so the reason it's counter-anti-disintermediation is because in the 90s we were talking about disintermediation. We were talking about these kinds of distributed systems that would change everything by allowing individuals to communicate in unmediated fashion with others. So we were imagining disintermediated banks and governments and all kinds of different things, right? The trouble is there's a lot of rich and powerful people that were kind of invested in the mediation. And so they created their own strategies to resist these trends, which we call anti-disintermediation. And so now at this stage, if we're to move forward, we need to develop a reaction to that we call counter-anti-disintermediation. Right? And core to the counter-anti-disintermediation principle is the end-to-end principle. The idea that all the functionality of systems should run in the end nodes and not in the intermediary nodes, because this is the only way you can engineer systems that are properly privacy-respecting, censorship-resistant, and scalable, right? Unless it's end-to-end, then the network can't give us the kind of guarantees that we need from the network to engineer the sort of consent-oriented systems we want to engineer. So it has to give guarantees of privacy, censorship resistance, scalability, anonymity, and those sorts of things. And only end-to-end systems can deliver those and provide those guarantees. But even more to the point of the counter-anti-disintermediation is that profit requires centralization, right? So the anti-disintermediationist strategies are all about figuring out a way to combat their competition in the decentralized things with centralized models, because they need to centralize things. And venture capital is interested in building central solutions. So they use their money and they develop these strategies. Here's our pal Halvarian again, who's kind of like the E.J. Wakefield of the internet. And he says, since information technology products work in systems, switching any single product can cost users dearly. The lock-in that results from such switching costs confers a huge competitive advantage to firms that manage their installed base of customers effectively, right? So lock-in is kind of the core idea of anti-disintermediation. By locking you in to certain systems, they can effectively compete against other centralized systems and distributed systems as well. And that's not the only one. They have lots of other great ideas, like proprietary APIs. So you make an open system, but the APIs are proprietary because you're running them. So like S3, for example, right? Penetration pricing, which means we spend a shitload of money to make sure that anybody trying to compete with us will go bankrupt, and then we have the market, right? And the monopoly of durable goods, this is a really good one. So whenever they sell you a phone or a computer, they think of that as now a competition. So the computer that just sold you is actually competition to the computer they want to sell you, right? So that's the monopoly of durable goods, and then you have planned obsolescence and all this kind of stuff that's trying to get the durable goods they've already sold you out of production so they can sell you more durable goods, right? And these are all terms that are used by Varian and other economists that advise companies like Google. And they're used in a positive sense. They're not used in a negative sense. When they talk about proprietary APIs, penetrating prices, winning standards wars is another very popular one, right? These are all used in a positive sense. So these are the anti-disintermediationists. And in order for us to really build distributed systems, we have to confront these strategies, and we have to have a reaction to these strategies, right? For the principles of counter-anti-disintermediation are end-to-end, each-to-each, technological disobedience, and counter-politics. And so what we mean here, right, so capitalism is the problem, right? I guess I said that already. So we need a society where productive capacities are directed towards social value and not profit, right? And this is more problems. Another problem, a big problem, is that technology is actually made out of blood. The supply chain of technology consists of colonialism, war, exploitation, poison, right? And so this is another thing that we need to address and confront. If we're saying that we're going to use technology to make things better, then we have to confront the idea that actually the technological industry as it is right now is highly destructive, highly exploitive, highly poisonous, and geopolitically very, very problematic. Right, so this is where we come to the proposal for venture communism, right? So in order to kind of address this, it's not a one area kind of thing. We need the technology, we need the politics, we need everything kind of to work together to kind of thread the needle if we have any hope to really kind of confront the anti-disintermediationist threat. And so we need networks of federated cooperatives employing technological disobedience that build counter-anti-disintermediationist platforms that support counter-politics, right? And so server... No. No, we just like funny words. But server-based solutions are impossible. So one thing that I find very frustrating is the amount of work that goes into projects like Diaspora and StatusNet. No disrespect to those projects, but I consider those kind of like cargo cults kind of platforms, because they're just taking like a centralized thing like Facebook and making it a little bit less centralized by using federated groupware kind of model. It's exactly what Usenet and email and stuff was. It's exactly the kind of architecture that was already defeated by the anti-disintermediationists, right? So kind of recreating a new version based on 10,000 Ruby gems is not really gonna move us forward, right? So one of the reasons that we need to move to end-to-end is to remove servers and admins, because servers and admins need to be paid for. As soon as you have any kind of centralized infrastructure, you have capital. All of a sudden, that needs to be paid for, and then eventually you're going to need some answers to how you're going to pay for it as it scales, because as you get more users, you need more resources. So as you grow, you're going to have to figure out a way to pay for this, and that's going to come from capture of user data and control of user interaction, because that's the only way that can work. So your need to earn profit will actually eventually cause you to be captured by capital, right? But end-to-end is possible, because with proper end-to-end systems, the more users you have, the more resources you have, right? So every net new user is actually an asset to the network, because they're adding resources to the network. They're adding hard drive space, they're adding disk space, they're adding CPU capacity, they're adding stuff to the network because it's a distributed system. That's what makes it scalable and sustainable, right? So no servers, no admins, or as Leaf says, no SPOFs, no admins. Platforms must be end-to-end. That's the only way we're actually going to re-decentralize things, not by just having little freedom boxes in our house or like collectively managing a diaspora pod, right? And we need to be technologically disobedient. We need to understand that the technology is built out of blood and that the industry is actually working against us. So we need to get more value out of the technology than the producers want us to get. So we need to use it for longer. We need to use it in different ways. We need to use it in creative ways. The term was coined by a Cuban-American artist called Ernesto Orozco, and he used it to describe the way technology is used in Cuba, because Cuba's been under this massive embargo for a really long time, and as a result, they have very little access to technological imports. So they're very clever about using things in various ways, using a part from one machine to fix a different machine that were never actually intended to be replaceable, by using things really way longer, by developing ways to fix things that the industry never wanted you to fix, right? And keeping things in production longer, using it differently, right? This is the way that we can gain more value out of the technology rather than pay more to the actual IT industry and have that value go into more poison, more war. Right? So we must be technologically disobedient and counter-anti-disintermediationist. I can only say that word about 5 times before I lose it. Or we will either fail or be integrated with capitalism. So if we don't do these things, as well as engineer distributed systems, then our projects will either just simply fail or will be integrated with capitalism, will just be absorbed and co-opted by capital. Right, transvestment. Oh, it's supposed to be a picture there. Oh, there it is. All right, yeah, so one of the other ideas is transvestment. Often within politics, there's this kind of sequentialist idea of history. Like first we had feudalism, then the capitalists came and smashed feudalism, and they set up the bourgeois state, and then the workers are going to get together, and we're going to smash the bourgeois state, and then once we do that, we'll create the worker state, which will slowly wither away towards communism. This strikes me as a highly unlikely scenario. From the first of all, it doesn't actually properly explain the history, because the capitalists didn't smash the feudal state and make capitalism. Capitalism was already developing for a long time within the feudal state, and actually the smashing only came about when they were contesting for power, where two very strong modes of production were contesting for power, and one was contesting for dominance, right? And so I see our own further progression in the same way, is that we have to build the kind of social relations and ways of working together and sharing that we want now. And we have to build those within the bourgeois state, and the only time there will ever be any kind of contestation for power, where our new decentralized ways of producing and sharing finally contest for dominance against the capitalist state, right? So this means that we think multimodally, that we think that every mode of production that's possible under any given social conditions is actually happening within some structure. And the goal is not to actually replace one with another in some kind of sequence. The goal is to increase the size of the ones we think are good, and decrease the size of the ones we think are bad. And so transvestment is one way to think about this. Is about moving value from one mode of production to another. Right? And we must direct our economic power towards counter-politics, or we will fail to confront capitalism. So we have to put the technology, in order to have the kind of effect that we want to have in terms of disintermediation, just making it is not enough. We have to put it in the hands of social movements. We have to put it in the hands of actually organized people that are working towards change. So what does counter-politics mean? It means confronting existing social institutions to protect social conditions. So supporting struggles to win and protect rights to health, housing, food, water, education, childcare, etc., is just as important as building a new society within the shell of the old. Because if we cannot protect the conditions that we work under, we don't have the capacity to build anything new at all. And that's it. Yeah, hi, go ahead. Thank you. We have a little bit of time, but sure, yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay, yeah. Um, uh, on the blockchain question, I think the blockchain has all kinds of like interesting properties that could be useful or could be not useful. I think what's the name of your title, Brett? The one about the Hobbesian Leviathan. The blockchain is Hobbesian Leviathan. Techno-Leviathan. Brett has a great article on that subject called Techno-Leviathan as the potential of the blockchain as being this kind of Hobbesian Leviathan, which I think is very interesting. But at the same time, you know, I acknowledge Bitcoin is a historically important project, but at the same time, I also have problems with proof of work, with the universal availability of the DHT, and all kinds of other nations. So I don't want to get too technical about Bitcoin because it's a multi-dimensional thing. In terms of the social automation, I think that's I kind of agree. Shared servers are fun. I like them. I run several, but that's kind of like very community cultural kind of like space. If we're talking about the communication capacity for all the people on the planet, a really egalitarian communication system, it has to scale to 7 billion people, or it's not scalable. And from that point of view, anything that requires servers and intermediaries is simply not going to scale. I don't think of that as atomization as such, because I think it's actually one giant shared server is what it is, because it's like everybody's computer makes up this shared network that's composed of its own interconnections, right? So I don't think of so much as atomization as actually like radical collectivization.
Also goes to you, Kate. Your question basically about, like, you know, we can go all decentralized that we want. We're still building systems, and we are doing this kind of like in cybernetic terms, like in system thinking, you know. And then how does that actually the real world, right? Like this room. You can make a model of this room, of the interactions going on, everybody on the phone and so on. But it's very hard to actually get a completely accurate model. And then it's also very hard to say, how should we regulate this and so on. And just mentioning this, like this piece of a discussion that might make sense to you or not, is actually going on for a couple of days already between various people. And tomorrow at 2 o'clock at the Communism actually, in ThoughtWorks Werkstatt, there's a session which is actually termed, it's a collaboration between various people, and it's called How to Evade Cybernetic Capitalism, which actually relates to what Kate just said and what you say. And I think there's various interesting pieces of, I think Hegazi also wants to come, who gave the Transport for Cairo talk and so on. But there's also other people, non-tech people coming, like an artist, and some other people. And it's going to be a discussion like between those people, and then we, try to make sense of each other. So I just wanted to hijack that interaction to actually highlight that. And more questions. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean that's why the so-called Varian plan is not the same as the Wakefield plan, right? The Wakefield plan was let's get the government to buy all the land and we'll sell it off. The Varian plan is lock in proprietary PIs, penetration pricing, like all that stuff. The penetration pricing, exactly what you're talking about with the shiny stuff. Let's spend $1 million making something that looks really great and marketing the shit out of it, right? I think. Yeah, well, they're just users, right? There was, yeah. The arts group each way, sure. I mean, there was a tremendous amount. But I mean, the outcome is kind of similar, right? If you had it, yeah. I think we probably should wrap up because we're already way behind schedule, and there's probably another with movements that are working to protect housing rights, benefits, childcare rights, education.